Hello, and welcome to my COMS 333 Games, Media, and Culture lecture titled Video Games as History. So, today's lecture is going to attempt to answer very briefly the question of how do video games interact with the past. We can all think of numerous games that have some sort of a connection to the past, whether it be historical games that are trying to recreate a period or using history in other ways. So there's early examples of this, like Capcom's 1944X series starting in 1984, or more popular series like early Call of Duty games starting in 2003, which were mimicking Medal of Honor starting in 1999, or even other games such as Valkyria Chronicles that started in 2008. So all of these games are examples of games that are trying to interact with the past in some way. So whether that is through history or historical fiction, if they're using allegorical representations of the past, collective memory, narrative tropes, settings, any number of different things like this. So this is a very common genre within games, so there's a lot that we can actually say about them. And because of that, there are a lot of theories surrounding video games as history, which I'm going to run through just very briefly so that you have some sort of an understanding of what they are. So the first was something that we read for last week, which was Capel and Elliott, and they have this idea of accuracy versus authenticity. So Capel and Elliott argue that when video games are interacting with the past, or when video games are interacting with history, that they're not trying to be accurate. So they're not trying to take what you would find in a history book and to put it directly into a game. Instead, they're trying for something that's called authenticity. And this authenticity is based not off of what actually happened in the past, but what people think happened in the past, and trying to recreate that. Now, they don't really go into where this authenticity comes from. There are numerous places where it can come from, but James Campbell offers an idea of where it comes from through the idea of remediation. So remediation is actually taken from Bolter and Grusin, and on its simplest levels, it's just trying to discuss how we take narratives and put them from one media type and into another. So, for example, you have if we're talking about World War II, you've got a textbook has a very specific genre of how that you're going to tell the story or the narrative of World War II. If you put it into a movie, it's going to be put in a different way. So with the textbook, it's going to be 300 pages, 600 pages, whatever it's going to be. It's going to be written in that historical style, like this happened, then this happened. You wouldn't necessarily do that in a film. So Saving Private Ryan is different from a history textbook, and when we want to tell World War II stories in a video game, they're different from Saving Private Ryan. You wouldn't have a 12-hour movie, and you also wouldn't have like a 1.5-hour game. You wouldn't have a game where you have no input and you sit there the entire time. So remediation just is the way that we use stories and put them into other media types. So James Campbell, he reacts to this and says that we use remediation in the way that we put history into video games. I'm going to stick with the World War II examples because that is the thing that I study and the thing that I know most in history. I don't mean to sound like your grandfather, but I probably do. But I'm going to stick with that just because it's in my comfort zone. So when we look at what Campbell is saying, he says that genre conventions are also part of this. So the first part is remediation. You're going to take a chunk of history and you're going to put it into a game. So that might involve some sort of study of textbooks. It might involve having seen particularly movies, James Campbell says, are important. So when we see a World War II game, it's not about trying to make World War II or to accurately depict World War II. It can be just about how have movies depicted World War II and then putting that into a game. Outside of that, there's certain genre conventions. So in sticking with this example, when we look at something like the early Call of Duty games or Medal of Honor games, they're not trying to recreate World War II. They're trying to recreate first-person shooter genre conventions. So the experience of a combat soldier in World War II is not what you're experiencing. You're experiencing something akin to early FPS games like Doom or Wolfenstein or even more recent games like Halo or Destiny. Video games are trying to follow that rather than having an historical accuracy. So this is where this authenticity comes from. Authenticity can come from other genres, or authenticity can come from other types of media. People have expectations as to what historical time periods were like, and video games very much capitalize off of them. So Capella and Elliott and Campbell are both very concerned with this idea of accuracy and how historical video games are not accurate, which is a legitimate consideration, but is not really the only way that we need to think about how the past is used in video games. So there are two other scholars who think of games as doing history, or how they create a very specific video game type of history. So Adam Chapman has an idea that he calls historioludicity. When a historian writes a history book, they might write about a certain event, and other historians will also write about that event. Then there's something in history that is called historiography, which is the history of how that history is written. It is the most boring form of history. It is the type of history that I practice myself. But it is that is one way of talking about history, is taking all that everyone has written about a certain subject and then writing about the differences between that. And we can see Chapman's historioludicity being similar to that, where a game will create a historical, will be a historical piece, and it is about how you play through that is what is creating history. So for Chapman, to just summarize briefly, historioludicity is a way of video games making their own history, making historical arguments, and becoming part of maybe a wider historiography. A similar idea to this is actually Kurt Squire, who has something called the historical possibility space. In his dissertation, he writes about Civilization, a series in which you become a historical leader, like an actual historical leader, and then build an empire. Now, this is not completely accurate, because you'll have like Cleopatra fighting against Napoleon and Abraham Lincoln, all different times, and they never really fought each other. But what Squire argued, that within these sorts of games, that players would recreate certain historical facts. One being colonialism. I mean, as you play these games, you have to take over territories, and one of the ways you do that is by taking native lands. So Squire argued that the game provided, once again, what he called a historical possibility space, where a player, by playing the game, could learn larger processes of history that would become, and could be very educational. So just to summarize briefly, Capella and Elliott and Campbell are talking about historical practice in terms of accuracy, whereas Chapman and Squire are talking about historical practices in terms of like choices and historiography and the way that history is written. Now, moving beyond that, these are all very legitimate questions and very legitimate ways of looking at how games talk about the past, but we also need to ask, like, what is not asked by these theorists? What is some of the missing connections, or what can we do with this to expand our knowledge of how the past is being used? Personally, I use collective memory. Collective memory is a sociological field that has actually been kind of co-opted by numerous different fields ever since then. It starts, very briefly, this history, it starts in the 1930s with a French theorist named Maurice Hoblox, and he writes a book called The Collective Memory, which is all about the way that societies remember. So instead of being Freudian and like memory being a psychological process, in collective memory, all that you really need to know is that it becomes a sociological or societal process. So people remember in relation to things within their everyday lives. So there's two ways to think about this, is that Hoblox makes an argument for something that he calls like landmarks. So you could have like a memory landmark could be something either in your personal life or in society at large. So you could say post-World War II and remember things in relation to that, or more commonly, you have certain things that happen within your life. So I'm sure that you've heard your parents say that something happened before they had kids. And having kids becomes a dividing line in the way that they remember and the way that they position their memories within that. Now, To complicate this, when we talk about this on a larger societal scale, obviously there's things that affect this collective memory that have to do with power structures. So, for example, when we're talking about history, history is typically taught by, is typically governmentalized in some way. So you learn history in school, you learn a specific history, you learn from specific books, specific ways of thinking about the past, particularly of your own country. So in Canada, usually you're going to be reading textbooks that are about how great multiculturalism is, and maybe avoiding some of our larger problems with settler colonialism, or even within immigration and some of the problems that we've had with that. So that's just collective memory in a nutshell. It's been expanded out into something called cultural memory. Numerous theorists have written about that. About how it connects to monuments, or even the way that it connects to how we interact with media. So some of that stuff is very interesting, but really not what we're talking about today. All that we can take out of that for today that is important is just to remember that history is not necessarily, or history or the past, is not necessarily connected to this idea of truth, but is instead connected to this idea of narrative, of avoidance in some cases, of using the present in the past rather than it being about the past. So it's not about what happened, it's about how we can use that now. And this is a very important question to think of when we talk about video games as history. So how is the past used in the present? This is something that I tried to cover with my game Nagasaki Kitty, which you all played. But it is also something that we can see in more mainstream games as well. So when you play one of the original Call of Duty games, which is about American soldiers winning World War II, you really do need to question some of the things that are happening in there and what it is trying to tell us about now. For example, we could look at Call of Duty World at War, which was the last World War II game in the series. And we can see some of the things that happen in that game and question why they're in there, or why they're depicted in the way that they are. There is a depiction of bombing that occurs in that game, but what happens is you are in this you're in a bomber, and you get a radio call that tells you that there are some Japanese transport ships that need to be, that you're supposed to go and bomb. And the pilot even questions, like, well, aren't those civilian vessels? And they say, no, they're armed, so they're part of the war. So it immediately takes away some of the questioning of, should we be bombing people? How is that used in the present? Well, Americans particularly have continually bombed civilian populations since the end of World War II. If our games are telling us that it was okay to bomb people in World War II, it's easier to make that argument in the present. World War II, just as a side note, becomes particularly important in this because it is still viewed as the last good war. So despite the fact that Americans have bombed since that time, in Korea, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, throughout the Middle East, and particularly in Afghanistan today through drone strikes, you could make the argument that these games are reacting or capitalizing on this idea of bombing being okay, and even trying to justify it, if you wanted to read that through power structures. Which leads into our next question, is how do games serve entrenched power? In this case, you could make the argument that it is through this popularization of warfare, saying things are okay as a way of justifying what is happening in the present. However, we can look at this the other way, is how can games challenge these power structures? If we are going to be working with games as a medium, as a storytelling medium, and talking about the past, there are ways of looking at the past that question what is happening, or question what has happened and how it affects us now. So we can question things like bombing. We can question the use of military strength in general, or even when we are playing games like Civilization or any game like that, we can question larger structures of colonialism and how it affects us now. So just in brief conclusion, when we talk about how video games interact with the past, we need to consider first what is being said, how it's being said, who is saying it, and we need to ask questions. And in regard to this, as in anything, It's not a matter of asking questions. It's about asking the right questions. Thank you.